Project MKUltra, the architecture of erasing identity. Throughout human history, there has always existed a dangerous illusion that the mind is a fortress, an impregnable citadel whose keys are held only by its owner. But in the mid-20th century, when Cold War paranoia reached its peak, the Central Intelligence Agency, driven by fear of alleged Soviet mind control, decided that this fortress would not merely be stormed, it would be demolished to its foundation. The epicenter of this monstrous experiment was not a secret bunker in the Nevada desert, but the respectable Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. There, under the auspices of an unsuspecting Canadian government, and with covert CIA funding, one of the darkest chapters in medical history unfolded, Subproject 68. It was led by Dr. Ewan Cameron, a man whose ambitions extended far beyond the Hippocratic Oath, and who believed that the only way to heal a troubled mind was to completely destroy it. Cameron developed the theory of de-patterning, a method based on the assumption that a person's identity, with all its memories, habits, and moral foundations, was a flawed construction that had to be erased in order to build a new, ideal structure in its place. Patients who entered the clinic complaining of mild depression, anxiety, or postpartum disorders had no idea that by crossing Cameron's threshold, they were signing their own sentence, condemning themselves to serve as test subjects in a process that resembled medieval torture far more than medical treatment. The first stage of this destruction was drug-induced sleep. Individuals were placed into artificial comas that could last for weeks, sometimes even months, submerging consciousness into a viscous, timeless darkness, where the boundary between reality and nightmare dissolved. Yet the silence in those hospital rooms was deceptive. Hidden beneath the patient's pillows, speakers operated around the clock, broadcasting endless loops of recorded commands, a technique Cameron cynically called psychic driving. Hundreds of thousands of times, day after day, simple but destructive phrases were implanted into the defenseless subconscious of the sleeping subject, designed to break the will and suppress any resistance. When the body attempted to fight back, struggling to preserve the remnants of its own self, heavy artillery was deployed, electroconvulsive therapy at levels that today seem unthinkable. While standard practice involved administering 110 volts for fractions of a second, Cameron's subjects received shocks exceeding the norm by up to 40 times, repeated multiple times within a single day, effectively burning away the neural connections responsible for memory and self-identity. The result of this barbaric intervention was predictably tragic. Cameron did succeed in destruction. Patients awoke in a state of absolute tabula rasa, unable to recognize their spouses, forgetting their children's names, losing the ability to read, write, or even feed themselves. They regressed to the level of infants, stripped of any past. But the second half of the CIA's ambitious plan, the rewriting of personality, ended in catastrophic failure, proving that once the human soul is erased, it cannot be restored according to the blueprints of intelligence agencies. In the end, Subproject 68 left behind shattered lives and the horrifying realization that a government tasked with protecting its citizens was willing to sacrifice their minds in pursuit of the illusion of total control. We witnessed that a person can be broken, can be forced to forget their own name, but artificial loyalty cannot be constructed upon the ruins of a destroyed psyche. Where there once was a personality, only a ringing, terrifying emptiness remains. The radio-controlled brain, the Delgado Effect. If Cameron's experiments resembled a dark psychological thriller, then what unfolded on a sunny afternoon in 1963 in a bullfighting arena in Córdoba, Spain, looked more like the climax of a science fiction dystopia that had become terrifyingly real. In the center of the sandy ring, surrounded by a frozen crowd holding its breath, stood not a professional matador with a cape and sword, but a short man in a business suit and glasses, Yale University professor Jose Delgado, armed with nothing more than a small black box with 2 switches and an antenna. Opposite him snorting heavily and tearing up the sand with its hooves, stood a 1,100-pound bull named Lucero, an animal whose very nature seemed woven from pure, uncontrollable rage and centuries-old predatory instinct. But Delgado, who had devoted his life to studying the electrical nature of consciousness, possessed a secret unknown to the spectators. Days earlier, he had performed a delicate surgical procedure, implanting fine electrodes deep within the bull's brain, specifically in the caudate nucleus, connected to a miniature radio receiver mounted at the back of the animal's head. He called the device a stymoceiver the moment the enraged bull charged, accelerating toward the seemingly defenseless scientist, ready to gore him. Delgado did not step aside. He simply pressed a button on his transmitter, sending an invisible radio signal directly into the neural circuitry of the charging beast. The result, captured on film, stunned the world. Just a few feet from its target, the bull abruptly halted, kicking up a cloud of dust, as if it had collided with an invisible concrete wall. Then, losing all interest in violence, it calmly wandered away, transformed from a raging monster into a docile calf. This was not magic. It was not training. It was a demonstration of absolute technological power over biology. Delgado proved that free will, aggression, fear, even the will to live, are nothing more than electrical impulses that can be intercepted, suppressed, or, more disturbingly, triggered externally at the push of a button. Yet the professor's ambitions did not end with animals. Soon, he extended his experiments to humans, working with psychiatric patients who were implanted with stymocevers under the pretext of treating epilepsy and schizophrenia. In reports that today read like interrogation transcripts from a future inquisition, Delgado described how, by manipulating frequencies, he could drive a calm individual into sudden, uncontrollable rage, or conversely, plunge a patient into euphoric bliss, compelling them to profess love for their doctor. One subject, whose hand involuntarily clenched into a fist under electrical stimulation, said in horror, "I feel like I'm not the one doing this, but I can't stop it." In that moment, he articulated the deepest philosophical nightmare, the possibility of turning a human being into a biological puppet. Although by the 1970s, these experiments were deemed ethically questionable, and Delgado himself faced public backlash and ultimately returned to Spain, his legacy did not disappear. It simply retreated into the shadows, waiting for its time. Today, as we enthusiastically discuss brain-computer interfaces and Neuralink chips, we often forget that the foundation for these technologies was laid in that very arena in Cordoba. And the question Delgado left behind echoes louder than ever. If your emotions can be switched on by radio signal, who truly holds the remote control to yourself? The Soviet hybrid, the Red Frankenstein, in the turbulent 1920s, as the world struggled to recover from the Great War, and the first workers' and peasants' state rose from the ruins of the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks, intoxicated by the idea of remaking the universe, decided that overthrowing the Tsar and religion was not enough. Nature itself had to be overthrown. In this atmosphere of total rejection of the old gods, an idea was born that still, a century later, inspires disbelief for its audacity and cynicism. If there is no God, and man is merely a highly evolved animal, then what prevents us from intervening in evolution and creating a new, perfected species, one that unites the strength of the beast with the intellect of the proletarian? The man who volunteered to bring this nightmare into reality was Professor Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, a distinguished biologist and pioneer of artificial insemination, whose scientific achievements were undeniable, but whose moral compass seemed to have dissolved somewhere among the test tubes of his laboratory. Backed directly by Soviet government funding, officials who saw in the project a chance to strike a crushing blow against religion and prove the triumph of materialism, Ivanov did not head to a university lecture hall. Instead, he traveled to the sweltering jungles of French Guiana on a secret mission that made even hardened colonial officials uneasy. The goal of his 1926 expedition sounded like the plot of a gothic horror story. Ivanov planned to crossbreed humans with great apes, creating a hybrid privately referred to as the Human-Z. Under strict secrecy, in a primitive laboratory deep in the tropical forest, the professor began his experiments, attempting to inseminate female chimpanzees with human biological material, hoping that the genetic proximity of the species would overcome the biological barrier erected by millions of years of evolution. But nature, as if defending itself from this mad intrusion, responded with silence. None of the apes became pregnant. Obsessed with his vision, Ivanov decided to take a step that would permanently erase the line between science and crime. Returning to the Soviet Union, to the primate nursery he established in Sukhumi, he devised a reversal of the experiment. To recruit Soviet women willing to carry a hybrid, conceived with an orangutan. The plan sounds unimaginable, if not for surviving documents confirming that at least one woman, identified in the archives as Citizen G, provided written consent to participate in what can only be described as an act of biological sacrilege. Fortunately for humanity, this grotesque experiment was halted not by party ethics, but by the simple death of the last mature male orangutan, named Tarzan, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage before he could father a new species. Soon, political winds shifted. Ivanov's patrons fell victim to purges, and the Red Frankenstein himself was arrested and exiled to Alma-Ata, where he died in obscurity, leaving behind nothing but empty cages and a chilling question about the limits of what should ever be attempted. The story of the Human-Z project is not merely a tale of failure. It is a warning of what happens when science, stripped of conscience, attempts to play creator, forgetting that evolution's barriers may not exist by accident. We never saw an army of half-human, half-ape beings. But the mere fact that a state formally funded the creation of such monsters forces us to ask, what other projects, more successful and perhaps more terrifying, might have been carried out in closed cities whose archives remain silent to this day? Project Aversion, the operating room of hatred. If the experiments of Ivanov and Delgado could be dismissed as scientific curiosity gone out of control, the events that unfolded in the 1970s behind the walls of Military Hospital No. 1 in Pretoria were driven by pure, distilled ideological hatred. At the height of apartheid, when South Africa was surrounded by enemies and gripped by internal paranoia, the government concluded that the threat to national security did not come only from guerrillas carrying AK-47s, but from the biology of its own conscripts. In this distorted reality, homosexuality was declared not merely a sin or an illness, but an act of treason, a virus that weakened the Army's fighting spirit and made soldiers vulnerable to blackmail. To eradicate this so-called contamination, the South African Defence Force, SADF, initiated a secret program codenamed Project Aversion, placing it under the command of Colonel Aubrey Levin, a military psychiatrist who would later earn the press nickname Dr. Shock. Levin, a staunch believer in behaviorism, was convinced that sexual orientation could be corrected like a broken mechanism, if enough pain were applied. The method was brutally simple and resembled a perverse version of Pavlov's experiments. Young soldiers suspected of same-sex attraction were strapped to chairs, electrodes attached to their arms and genitals, and forced to view photographs of nude men. At the slightest sign of arousal, a powerful electric shock followed, intended to create a conditioned reflex of disgust, the very aversion that gave the project its name. But the most horrifying phase began when the electricity failed. For those deemed incurable, who endured the electroshock torture without altering their orientation, Levin and his team prepared a radical solution without precedent in modern medical history. Rather than discharge these soldiers, they subjected them to chemical castration or, almost unbelievably, forced sex reassignment surgeries. Between 1971 and 1989, approximately 900 gender reassignment procedures were performed on young conscripts in South African military hospitals, many of them barely 19 years old. This was not an act of compassion or support for transgender individuals. It was punitive medicine in its most extreme form. Young men were given a brutal ultimatum: prison and lifelong social exile, or surgery that military psychiatrists claimed would eliminate the problem by transforming a defective man into a woman. They were stripped of their past, issued new documents, prescribed hormones, and released into civilian life without psychological support, often without their parents ever being informed of what had happened to their sons in the Army. The consequences of this institutionalized conveyor belt of coercion were catastrophic. Many victims, whose bodies had been irreversibly altered against their will, could not survive the psychological devastation and died by suicide, unable to reconcile themselves with the imposed reality. When apartheid collapsed and the truth about Project Aversion surfaced, the world recoiled in horror. Yet justice was never fully served. Dr. Aubrey Levin, the architect of this nightmare, managed to emigrate to Canada, where he continued a respected medical career for years, shielded by the facade of a respectable citizen. The story of Project Aversion remains a bleeding wound in the history of medical ethics, a reminder that a surgeon's scalpel in the hands of a fanatic can be more terrifying than any weapon. It stands as a monument to how a state, obsessed with the idea of normality, can reshape living human beings like lumps of clay, forgetting that breaking a body is easy, but repairing a shattered soul is impossible. Liquid breathing, drowning into salvation. If space kills us through the absence of pressure, the ocean does the exact opposite. At a depth of just a few hundred meters, the weight of water can crush a human body like an empty tin can, turning air-filled lungs into a lethal trap. In the mid-1960s, at the height of the race to conquer the hydro-space frontier, scientists ran into an insurmountable barrier. Nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness made deep-sea missions impossible for humans without bulky submersibles. The solution came from an unexpected place, the laboratory of biochemist Leland Clark, who proposed an idea that sounded like madness. To survive crushing pressure, a human would have to stop breathing air and begin breathing liquid. The logic was ironclad. Liquids, unlike gases, are nearly incompressible. If a diver's lungs were filled with a special oxygen-saturated solution, external pressure would cease to matter, allowing a human to descend into the abyss as freely as a fish. The substance that made this possible was called perfluorocarbon, a clear, oily liquid capable of dissolving enormous amounts of oxygen, dozens of times more than human blood. Clark conducted a series of experiments that entered scientific history as the mouse in a jar. A rodent submerged in this solution was held underwater with a small grid. Instead of drowning, the mouse continued to breathe, drawing liquid into its lungs, and survived for hours, proving that mammalian lungs could function in a fluid medium. The most famous public demonstration of this technology appeared in James Cameron's cult film, The Abyss, where a rat is forced to breathe a pink liquid. Many viewers assumed it was a special effect, but the truth is more mundane and more disturbing. The scene was filmed live, using a real rat and real perfluorocarbon, and the animal truly survived, becoming an unwitting star of a scientific breakthrough. However, when it came to human trials, the technology encountered a barrier that neither chemistry nor physics could overcome: the barrier of primal terror. Physiologically, a human could breathe liquid. Psychologically, however, the brain interprets any fluid entering the airway as an unmistakable signal of imminent death. To begin breathing perfluorocarbon, a subject had to consciously suppress the most powerful survival instinct, forcing themselves to inhale while every cell screamed, "You're drowning!" The few volunteers who attempted it described the sensation as icy fire flooding the chest. But even if the panic of the first breath could be overcome, a second problem emerged. Perfluorocarbon is nearly twice as dense as water. To pump such a heavy substance through the lungs, the diaphragm had to work at its absolute limit, as if breathing thick syrup. Within minutes, muscle exhaustion set in. The body struggled to eliminate carbon dioxide, which accumulated in the bloodstream, leading to toxic buildup. The dream of freely descending into the Mariana Trench shattered against the fragility of human physiology. The Liquid Breathing Project was abandoned as a technology for special forces and divers, surviving only in intensive care units as a last resort treatment for premature infants, whose lungs have not yet forgotten what it was like to live in fluid. Once again, we were reminded that evolution is a one-way road. The ocean we emerged from millions of years ago is no longer ours to reclaim. Operation Midnight Climax, the psychedelic brothel. If you think mind control experiments were confined to sterile laboratories and sealed military bases, you are deeply mistaken. In the mid-1950s, the CIA decided that a true test of behavioral manipulation required moving into the field, into the raw core of real life, where human weaknesses and vices are fully exposed. Thus was born an operation with a name worthy of a cheap paperback detective novel, Operation Midnight Climax. The epicenter of this madness was not prison cells, but lavish, tastefully furnished apartments in the bohemian neighborhoods of San Francisco and New York. Officially, these locations were listed as safe houses. In reality, they were converted into high-tech traps. The walls were wired with microphones, and behind large mirrors in the bedrooms were hidden observation rooms with one-way glass, allowing agents to watch everything while remaining unseen. This theater of absurdity was run by George Hunter White, a former narcotics officer with the moral code of a street gangster and the badge of a federal agent. His mission was as simple as it was monstrous: find a way to break a person's will through a calculated mix of sex, drugs, and blackmail. To accomplish this, White recruited an army of prostitutes to work for the CIA. Their role was not only to entertain clients, but to secretly slip experimental doses of LSD into their drinks. The unsuspecting Johns, ordinary citizens stopping in to unwind after work, suddenly found themselves at the center of a psychedelic nightmare. As reality began to melt and fracture into hallucinated patterns, as panic overtook their minds, White would sit behind the two-way mirror, often with a martini in hand, coolly observing, like the director of a twisted reality show. Agents studied how LSD affected talkativeness. Could secrets be extracted from someone caught in sexual ecstasy, amplified by a bad trip? How deeply could they penetrate the subconscious once the mind's defensive barriers had been chemically dismantled? It was the perfect testing ground. The victims, having engaged in illegal acts, purchasing sex, had no safe avenue to report that government agents had drugged them. The CIA held absolute power over its subjects, destroying lives in the name of data collection. Some participants descended into psychosis, some took their own lives, and others were institutionalized, never realizing that their breakdown had been engineered in Washington. White later wrote with chilling cynicism, "I was a minor bureaucrat, but they gave me the license to play God in a brothel." The operation ran for nearly a decade, devolving into what amounted to an endless party funded by taxpayers, until it was shut down in 1963 amid internal scrutiny. But the most disturbing chapter came later. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms, recognizing the magnitude of the scandal, ordered the destruction of all MK-Ultra files. We know about Operation Midnight Climax only because a handful of financial records survived by accident, misfiled in the wrong folder. Thousands of hours of recordings, interrogation transcripts, and the identities of victims vanished forever into shredders at Langley. The project remains a stark reminder that intelligence agencies can turn an entire city into a laboratory, and its residents into expendable material. And the only force that can stop them is not law, but fear of public scandal. The Frey Effect, a voice inside the skull. We are used to believing that the mind is the last refuge of privacy. You can close the door, turn off your phone, Put in earplugs, and the world stays outside. But what if I told you there are doors that cannot be locked because they are not in the walls of your house, but in the physiology of your own brain? In 1961, American neurophysiologist Alan Frey, working at a laboratory at Cornell University, made a discovery that permanently altered the meaning of auditory hallucination. While studying the effects of radar exposure, he noticed a strange anomaly. People within range of microwave radiation reported hearing distinct clicking, buzzing, and even whistling sounds. Despite complete silence in the room, no sound waves were vibrating the air. The eardrums were perfectly still, and yet the sound was real. Frey uncovered the mechanism behind the phenomenon, and it was disturbingly simple. Microwaves at certain frequencies pass through the skull and are absorbed by brain tissue. This causes an extremely slight heating, fractions of a degree, known as thermoelastic expansion. The brain literally jolts from this microthermal shock, creating an internal pressure wave that travels directly to the inner ear. The person hears the sound not through their ears, but through the brain itself. The military immediately grasped the implications. If a click can be transmitted, then rhythm can be transmitted. And if rhythm can be transmitted, then theoretically, speech can be transmitted. Thus was born the concept of what would later be informally called the voice of God weapon. The idea was to beam words directly into the head of an enemy soldier or political leader, making them believe God was speaking to them, or to drive them insane with an inescapable whisper that offered no refuge. For decades, such projects were dismissed as conspiracy theory and science fiction, until 2016, when staff at the U.S. Embassy in Havana began reporting strange symptoms. Diplomats described hearing piercing, grinding noises or vibrations that no one else could hear. Soon after came nosebleeds, dizziness, and cognitive impairment, including symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury, despite no physical impact. The phenomenon became known as Havana Syndrome, and similar cases were soon reported in China, Russia, and even in Washington, D.C., near the White House itself. Medical scans of affected individuals revealed white matter changes in the brain consistent with concussion-like trauma, without any explosion or blunt force. Official intelligence reports still cautiously refer to these incidents as anomalous health incidents, carefully avoiding the word weapon. But Alan Frey's shadow looms over every case. We are confronting a technology that turns the human head into a receiver, and there is no defense against it. Tinfoil hats don't work. Concrete walls are permeable. The Frey Effect is a reminder that the barrier between yourself and the outside world is far thinner than it appears. And if one day you hear a voice telling you to do something, you will have no way of knowing. Are you losing your mind? Is God speaking to you? Or has someone simply aimed an invisible antenna at your window? Project Stargate, psychic spies. At the height of the Cold War, when nuclear parity forced the superpowers to seek any advantage, even the most absurd, American intelligence was shaken by alarming rumors. The Soviets were allegedly spending millions of rubles researching psychotronics and telepathy. The fear of falling behind in this mental arms race was so intense that the Pentagon and the CIA took a step that in any other era would have ended careers. They officially put magicians on the payroll. Thus, in 1978, deep within military intelligence at Fort Meade, a top-secret program was born. It changed names like Gloves, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Sunstreak, until it finally entered history under a name worthy of science fiction. Project Stargate. Its objective sounded absurd. Create a unit of psi spies capable of penetrating the Iron Curtain with the power of thought, reading documents locked in Kremlin safes, and locating hidden missile silos, all without leaving a chair in Maryland. The method they used was called remote viewing. It had nothing to do with crystal balls or seance tables. Everything was structured like a dry, bureaucratic procedure. An operator sat alone in an empty room with a sheet of paper, received a sealed envelope containing geographic coordinates, or sometimes just a random number, and entered a meditative state. The task was not to guess, but to describe sensory impressions, shapes, colors, smells, textures that surfaced in the mind in connection with those numbers. What was most astonishing was that sometimes it worked disturbingly well. The program's defining moment came when operator Joseph McMonigal, a former Army officer, was tasked with describing a site at coordinates in Severodvinsk. He sketched a massive building and an unusual structure inside it, something resembling a giant cigar. Skeptics laughed, until months later, satellite imagery confirmed it. The Soviets were indeed constructing a new Typhoon-class submarine, Project 941 Akula, the largest in the world, and it looked exactly like McMonigal's drawing, long before the CIA officially knew of its existence. Another legendary case involved the search for a crashed Soviet Tu-22 bomber in the jungles of Zaire. While satellites and reconnaissance aircraft scanned thousands of square miles with no success, psychic Rosemary Smith pointed to a spot on a map and said, "It's here." And it was. Yet Stargate had a fatal flaw: inconsistency. For every brilliant success, there were 10 complete failures. Operators might accurately describe a secret hangar, only to be off by a decade in timing. They might perceive a missile silo where there was only a water tower of similar shape. Military officials called it signal noise. For intelligence services that require facts, not visions, a 20% margin of error is unacceptable. You cannot launch an airstrike based on something someone merely saw in their mind. In 1995, after $20 million spent and thousands of sessions conducted, the CIA commissioned an independent review. The verdict was blunt. Remote viewing has not been demonstrated to have value for intelligence operations. The program was officially shut down and declassified. The public learned that for nearly 2 decades, the U.S. government had attempted to breach reality itself through thought alone. But veterans of the program insist the closure was merely a curtain. After all, if you discover a way to see through walls, even if it works only 1 time out of 5, do you announce it in the newspapers? Or do you quietly move it deeper underground, change the label on the door, and continue? The Tuskegee Experiment, 40 years of lies. We tend to believe that the most monstrous human experiments were carried out by Nazi doctors in concentration camps or by deranged lone scientists. But history offers examples where evil wore respectable white coats, was funded by the federal government of the world's most democratic nation, and lasted not 1 or 2 years, but 4 endless decades. This is the story of how the Hippocratic Oath was turned inside out and transformed into a license for slow, cold-blooded killing in the name of statistics. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service, PHS, launched a study in Macon County, Alabama, a place where poverty and illiteracy among the black population created ideal conditions for manipulation. The project's stated goal was to study the natural progression of syphilis in the Negro male. To accomplish this, 600 African American men were recruited, most of whom had never even been formally diagnosed. They were simply told they had bad blood, a local euphemism covering everything from anemia to fatigue, and were promised unprecedented generosity, free medical care, hot meals, and burial insurance. For men who had spent their lives working cotton fields and had never seen a doctor, this sounded like a blessing. What they didn't know was that the doctors had no intention of treating them. On the contrary, the medical staff's task was to ensure they did not recover. The participants were nothing more than living petri dishes, laboratory rats, whose sole function was to rot slowly, while men in white coats recorded how the disease consumed their bodies, brains, and nervous systems. The true crime against humanity occurred in 1947. By then, penicillin had become the widely available standard treatment for syphilis, a magic bullet, capable of curing the disease with just a few injections. The study should have ended. The men should have been saved. Instead, the program's supervisors made a decision that chills the blood. They deliberately concealed the existence of the cure from their subjects. Worse still, they actively prevented these men from receiving treatment elsewhere, circulating lists of their names to local physicians marked, "Do not treat." The researchers did not want cured patients. They wanted corpses. They wanted autopsies to see how syphilis destroyed the aorta and turned the brain into sponge-like tissue. The experiment continued through the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the early 1970s. While humanity landed on the moon, elderly men in Alabama were still dying from a medieval disease under the supervision of government doctors. During those decades, dozens of men died. Their wives were infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis, condemned to suffer from their very first breath. This conveyor belt of death stopped only in 1972, when the press exposed the story, triggering national outrage. The government formally acknowledged wrongdoing decades later. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The Tuskegee Experiment left behind not scientific data, but scorched earth, a legacy of distrust. To this day, many African American communities remain wary of doctors and vaccines, remembering how their grandfathers were treated with placebos and promises while their bodies fell apart. This was not an experiment. It was genocide by installment. Genetic twins, the era of GMO humans. If all the previous stories felt like relics of a distant past, covered in archival dust, prepare yourself. The final and most dangerous experiment did not take place in a classified Cold War bunker, but in plain sight during our own digital age. In November 2018, the scientific world was shaken not by the explosion of a bomb, but by a short YouTube video recorded by a young Chinese biophysicist named He Jiankui. With a smile more suited to unveiling a new iPhone, he announced that humanity had crossed the Rubicon. The first genetically modified humans in history had been born. Twin girls he referred to by the pseudonyms Lulu and Nana. This was no longer theory or dystopian fiction. These were living, breathing children whose genetic code had been manually edited like a text file at the embryonic stage. The tool behind this intervention was CRISPR-Cas9, molecular scissors, capable of cutting and replacing segments of DNA. His official goal sounded noble. He intended to disable the CCR5 gene, which acts as a gateway for the HIV virus. The twins' father was HIV positive, and the scientist claimed he wanted to grant his children innate immunity to the plague of the 21st century. It seemed like something the world should applaud. Instead, it triggered global panic. The problem was that human genetic engineering is not a precise science. It is a lottery. When independent experts gained access to partial data from the experiment, a disturbing truth emerged. The editing had been messy. The girls developed what is known as mosaicism. Some of their cells carried the edited gene, while others did not. Worse still, the molecular scissors may have cut DNA at unintended locations, potentially creating unpredictable mutations that could manifest 10, 20, or 50 years later as cancer or severe genetic abnormalities. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect lies elsewhere. The CCR5 gene does more than regulate HIV susceptibility. Studies in mice have shown that disabling this gene can significantly enhance memory and cognitive function, making the brain more adaptable and capable of learning. It is entirely possible that He Jiankui, intentionally or not, created not just children with immunity, but individuals with enhanced intelligence, a new class of superhumans long imagined in science fiction. The system reacted swiftly and harshly. The Chinese government, alarmed by the international backlash, arrested the scientist. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for illegal medical practice, and the existence of Lulu and Nana was placed under strict secrecy. No one knows where they are now, what they look like, or what is happening to their health. They are growing up under total surveillance, living artifacts of the post-human era. He Jiankui has since been released and returned to scientific work. But the genie is out of the bottle. We have entered an era in which evolution is no longer a blind process of natural selection. It is now a product, something that can be bought. The question is no longer whether we can create the ideal human, but who will hold the patent on their DNA. The experiment with Lulu and Nana proved one thing. We have learned to write the code of life, but we still do not know how to read it without making fatal mistakes. From memory erasure to genome rewriting, the history of science is filled with moments when the pursuit of knowledge turned into an obsession with control. These 10 projects are only the tip of the iceberg, the rare cases where the stamp "classified" was eventually removed. But how many more such files are gathering dust in archives right now? And perhaps the most significant experiment, the one we will only learn about 50 years from now, is being conducted today on us.